This is Off Script with Sally Hernandez. In 2014, a little boy, just 2 years old, full of life, once smiling and laughing in home videos.
Say hi, Dad. Hi, Papa. Say hi, Dad. Hi, Dad.
Is later found dead in a shallow, makeshift grave in the middle of an empty Austin, Texas field.
We have every reason to believe that the remains of that child are those of little Colton Turner.
In 2016, a freshman student from Portland, Oregon, 18-year-old Haruka Weiser, was walking to her dorm room at night on the University of Texas campus in Austin.
Haruka was a first-year dance major and a beloved member of the College of Fine Arts.
Murdered and found near a creek.
An autopsy was performed, and the medical examiner has ruled that this is a homicide.
2 different cases, 2 horrific, devastating crimes, with one thing in common. The seasoned Austin police homicide detective trained to find the body and catch a killer. Detective Anthony Nelson doesn't talk about his work unless you're part of the criminal investigation, but he's talking about it now with me. He's talking about 2 of the most notorious crimes that have changed Austin, cases he has helped to solve, and he's sharing details he has never talked about before when it comes to those cases, and how seeing so much death as a homicide detective has changed his life. This is an off-script discussion with Detective Anthony Nelson of the Austin Police Department. Thanks for being here. I know that you're busy.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Of course, this is Anthony Nelson. Is it still detective with the Austin Police Department?
I am still a detective with the Austin Police Department. That's correct.
Okay. And we'll talk about maybe in the background if you hear a little bit of that noise. It is a canine that you brought to the studio, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But before we talk about what you're doing with the Austin Police Department today, I want to talk about what you were doing back in 2016. April 3rd, 2016 is the last time somebody saw Haruka Weiser alive. She was leaving the drama building on the UT campus around 9:30 at night, walking home, a dance major from Portland, Oregon, when she was found dead in Waller Creek next to the Alumni Center. Investigators were called out on April 5th, so 2 days after she was reported last seen. You got the call.
Well, so what had occurred was that the University of Texas had the call. They knew that the victim, Miss Weiser, was missing, and they were looking for her. While they were looking for her, they found a body of a female in Waller Creek.
Okay.
Once they found her body, obviously they put 2 and 2 together and said, this is probably Mrs. Weiser, and we don't know for a fact, but we suspect that she's the victim of a crime. They called the Austin Police Department for assistance, the homicide unit for assistance, because they, as well capable of investigators as the University of Texas has in their police department, they don't deal with death and homicide very often.
This was the first homicide on the University of Texas since 1966, and that's when Charles Whitman opened fire from the UT Tower.
That is correct.
Killing 14 people.
Yeah. So when this occurred, they asked for our assistance. There was a lot of things that had to be delegated or worked through with the University of Texas, with the Austin Police Department. But I think the final word was through President Fenves, actually. He said, the Austin Police Department will be the lead investigation unit on this, and we will assist in every single possible way.
Because it was a big deal. I mean, I remember that day. I was wrapping up the morning shift over at the news station, and we got the alert from the University of Texas saying that there was a body that was found in Waller Creek. Do you remember getting the phone call to go and help? And I remember it was a sunny
Yes,
day
it was a beautiful day out. Yeah, it was a beautiful day. I remember because we got the call, and I was the next detective in line for a murder. Because the on-call in homicide, you kind of wait your turn.
You rotate.
Yeah. And I was the next detective in line for a murder case. And when the call came out, we knew, okay, this is something that is not going to be it's kind of weird to say the word normal in a murder case. But I wanted to go with the detective who would be my guy who would process the scene.
Because when you say normal, it's because you do find bodies that are along Waller Creek. It happens more than anyone would think. Because sometimes these are deaths that are not suspicious.
That's correct.
But this one was a suspicious one.
So I always had a problem with the word suspicious when it came to death. Because if someone dies outside and it's not even if they are transient, they still have something that looks home to them, a campsite, something of that nature. And people die every day.
Yeah.
But for me, I always went through the thought of every death is suspicious.
Why?
If you have that mindset that every death is suspicious and you go into investigating that death as every death is suspicious, then the likelihood of you missing something, it will be very small.
I see.
Yeah. So I didn't like the connotation of, well, it's just some homeless guy that's dead in Waller Creek.
Right.
I always said, no, it's all suspicious. Why is someone deceased in Waller Creek?
That makes sense.
Yeah. But going back to Miss Weiser, that obviously was it was a day, it was the beginning of something that it's going to stay in my life forever.
Why?
Because, and this is going back to the word normal.
Okay.
In Austin, Texas, you rarely get a stranger on stranger murder. If someone is murdered by someone they never known, that's not a regular thing in Austin, especially. And so it kind of, we know that if that's the case, then that's going to be a lot of work. Even if Miss Weiser did not get murdered on the University of Texas campus, for a stranger to do this is not normal.
Before you got to know that this was a stranger and before you got a suspect name, walk me through when you decided to go to the crime scene, what you saw and what you felt.
And so one of the very first things that the University of Texas, and you have to applaud that police department. One of the very first things that happened was they started their own canvas of cameras.
Okay.
And once they started that canvas of cameras, they, right at the entrance of where one would walk behind the Alumni Center and the College of Liberal Arts, they noticed, hey, there's a camera here. Let's see if we can see Miss Weiser walking from the drama building, because you could see, if that's the direction she was walking, you would see her walking in that area.
Okay.
And the University Police Department had already had footage of the Sunday night when they would have suspected Miss Weiser to be walking through that area. And they saw an individual in that camera footage, and the individual's actions in that camera footage was more than one would say would cause them to be a suspect in someone's disappearance. They were obviously stalking other females seen in that footage. Mm-hmm. Then they started pulling back more footage from the Alumni Center and from other spots on the campus, and they noticed that, yes, this same person is riding their bike throughout the campus, and that same person is stalking females. It was obvious. So they started putting that together very shortly after I had arrived.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you got to the crime scene, then they had already been going through some surveillance video that showed maybe Hadika had been walking from the drama building over to the creek. And then that's when they noticed that there was this other figure that was on camera that seemed to be following her, but not only her, other women on campus?
Yes. That figure, when they first observed him in the area where Hadika was, who obviously we believed was Hadika, when they first observed that figure, they went back and started looking for him further.
Okay.
And when they went back to look for him further, they noticed that he was following women on campus. That was disturbing. That was disturbing to watch. To know that there was an individual there whose sole purpose was there to follow females on campus.
When that happens and when you have that evidence with you, do you go to the creek to gather more evidence? Do you go to actually see the body?
I did. There's a process in any murder scene. And as much as one person would want to run up there to see what's going on, you want to take that in stages. And that's exactly what we did. I, myself, as a lead investigator, started talking with some of Hadika's closest friends on the campus. And during that time, Detective Tynes with the Austin Police Department Homicide Unit started his job in processing the scene. It got to a point where, as he worked from the area where we saw the individual and Hadika on footage, he worked from there, and then he worked towards where her body was.
Okay.
Looking for everything that they can find, any type of evidence that they believed was evidence. And then once they got to her body, they decided, okay, they called me and said, okay, we're going to move her body. I get over to the scene and I'm able to observe what was going on with her body, the evidence on her body, the evidence around her body.
And this may sound like a crude question, but how do you not get so emotionally attached? This was a 18-year-old girl who had been dancing a few hours before she was found dead.
Anyone who works homicide will tell you have to completely detach the human in you and become just that investigator. You have to look at her body, any body, and even children. You have to look at them and their body as evidence. I would tell young officers who would be on the scene of a dead baby, hey, I know this hurts. I know this is not right. There's nothing right about this. But cry when you get home, because right now you have to be a professional. So the things that were seen there, the things that were photographed, the articles, and to see what a human being can do to another will always be with you. It will be with every person that watched what had occurred to Hadika.
What did happen to Hadika?
Well, the case has been adjudicated, and I still don't want to be extremely graphic, but she was strangled and sexually assaulted. The sexual assault, obviously, she was nude. There was a ligature that was around her neck still at that time, and that ligature was it was still there, and it was extremely tight. She was obviously, when I say sexually assaulted, but she was also physically assaulted. There was obvious trauma to her head and her face, and then other parts of her body.
The suspect in the case, and you said that it is closed, and his name is Mikhail Kreiner. And after our discussion about some of the other cases, when you listen to this episode of our podcast, we'll give you an update to our listeners of Mikhail Kreiner. You mentioned that you also tell detectives that there are some cases when the victim is a kid.
Yeah. Yeah.
The first kid that comes to mind was a case also that you were involved in, and that has to be Colton Turner.
Yeah, absolutely.
2-year-old Colton Turner. So some background for our listeners is that Colton Turner was last seen with his mom, Megan Work, and she was 21 years old at the time. And from what we understand is that there were several investigations, CPS investigations into Colton because they couldn't find him, his other extended family. And when they did find him, were there photographs taken about bruises on his body?
Yeah.
Okay.
My understanding in the initial phases of that investigation was that because no one had seen Colton since around July, and mind you, this was September when he was reported missing, but no one had seen him since July, the conversation between his extended family was on Facebook. And they were asking around, hey, have you seen Colton? Have you seen Colton? And no one had seen him. And I think it was Megan's aunt who had actually posted some photographs and said, hey, the last time I saw Colton, this is what he had on him. And it was obvious marks, bruises from a belt or some type of strap that were along his face and along his body. Yeah. So obviously there was some issue going on with his disappearance.
And this was back in 2014. And so then how does the questioning of Megan come into play? So CPS can't find Colton, and then how does it become a criminal investigation?
So what had occurred was someone on Facebook had decided, well, everybody's talking about this, but they're not calling the police. And they contacted the Cedar Park Police Department.
And Cedar Park is a suburb of Austin.
That's correct.
Okay.
And so they contacted the Cedar Park Police Department, and once the police department, they found where Megan was sleeping, and they started to question her. Her initial story to police was that Colton was at her friend's house, whom she dropped Colton off with in, I think it's pronounced Saxe.
Near Dallas.
Near Dallas.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
When they asked her, hey, Megan, where is that? She said, oh, it's near Houston. Mm. And some people, the flags went up, and they said, okay, well, let's talk to that friend. Where does your friend live? The police department call the Saxe Police Department and have them go to the friend's house. Once those police officers get there, that friend was interviewed by Saxe Police, and that friend said, I have no idea. I have not seen Colton in X amount of time. And while those officers were there, that friend received a text from Megan saying, hey, just tell him Colton's with you. He's fine. And I'll explain later.
So according to investigators, she changed her story 3 times. That was one story.
That was one of them.
And then the other stories were about how somebody kidnapped Colton.
Yes.
In Austin at an intersection. Another one was that she voluntarily gave Colton to a family at a Chick-fil-A in Austin.
Yes. Yes. She was not known for being truthful. And once she gave a kidnapping story, that's when the FBI got brought in. At the same time that they're interviewing Megan, they interview Megan's boyfriend, Michael Turner. Okay. Apparently, the two had worked on keeping a story straight. But after some time, I can tell you that Michael Turner, he was the guy with the heart. And eventually, he told officers that Colton was not alive.
How do you know he was the guy with the heart? Did you interview him?
I interviewed him after his initial interview.
Okay.
And I can say he's the guy with the heart because if it had not been for Michael, that's the one thing I can say. And I can say that to prosecutors. I could say that to his defense attorney. I can say that to the family members that still will blame him for Colton's death. He was if it wasn't for him, we would have never found Colton's body.
That's significant to me because when this was all happening, and I remember being on the morning show, and it was around 5 o'clock, maybe before then, and we kept getting phone calls and tips about there's this huge police presence in Southeast Austin.
Yeah.
And the sun hadn't even come up yet. And we were trying to figure out what is going on over there.
Yeah.
And we were still getting word about how there's this missing little boy in Cedar Park. And I thought, these got to be connected over here.
Yeah.
What was happening in Southeast Austin?
So I'm going to kind of go back a little bit. When you were reporting this missing boy in Cedar Park, you were reporting it on a Friday. And I remember I had been on call, and actually I had been on call and I was covering for one of the best detectives in the Austin Police Department, Dave Fugit.
Dave.
I was actually covering for him, and he asked me, "Can you cover for me one more day?" Because he was working a plane crash that had occurred, and he was assisting in that. He had been out in the field all day. And I said, absolutely. And I remember driving home, listening to the story of the missing boy in Cedar Park. And because of the time frame that was given over the media, I feared what everyone else was fearing, that this child was deceased. So as time had gone by, and the case was being worked, I think it was Thursday into Friday, if I remember correctly. As the case was being worked, I get the call from the on-call Austin Police homicide supervisor, and they said, "Hey, I need you and Detective Ray Tynes again.
Mm-hmm.
I need you guys to come meet us at the Cedar Park Police Department on that missing kid case."
Okay.
There's a connection into Austin. Well, with that being said, obviously we knew, okay, either the child was found in Austin or the child was murdered in Austin. And once we got to the Cedar Park Police Department and were completely briefed on the whole case, we were notified that Michael Turner was actually on his way down from the San Saba County Jail to show investigators where the child was buried.
Was he in jail in connection to Colton or for something else?
No, for something totally different.
Okay, so here's Megan being questioned about where's Colton in Cedar Park, and then Michael Turner, meanwhile, is in jail on an unrelated charge.
That's correct.
So they're separated at the time of investigators trying to figure out where is little Colton.
That's correct.
Okay, and then what does Megan say to investigators at Cedar Park that lead you to believe that this was a case where Colton was dead?
Nothing.
Nothing.
Her story, like you had said, her story was that the first where she was, Megan, Colton's with a friend. And then when that was proved to be false, Colton was kidnapped. When that was proved to be false and she was confronted with that, that's when her story stayed of that she gave Colton to some unknown strangers. So, but she had never said Colton's deceased. She had never said anything about Colton not being in this world anymore. So we weren't, I say we as investigators, we're not getting anything truthful out of Megan. It was Michael who had enough heart to let that child be in peace.
What did he tell you?
He said that he basically remembered Colton being with Megan while he was at work, and he was inside of the job and at a local business in Austin. He heard Megan yelling. He ran out, and Colton wasn't responding. He drove Colton, that he was going to drive Colton to the hospital. Megan had made some comment of, we can't take him to the hospital because of any bruising that he may have on his body. So we need to just go ahead and take him back to our hotel room. And so that's what they did. They took him to a hotel room. And they waited overnight, and overnight he passed away. Again, they didn't want to get in trouble. So they took him out to a location in Southeast Austin. They buried him. And here's where the time frame was kind of not very well understood.
Okay.
They buried him once I believe that they waited overnight and realized he's going to be located, and they went back, retrieved him, and buried him again.
That's what I read in the court records too, is that Michael said that they found out that he was dead when they woke up that morning, took him out to a location, and he started digging with a knife or something small.
Yeah.
And it wasn't big enough and good enough. And so they returned with Colton in the vehicle back to the hotel they were staying with their dead kid in the hotel room.
I am not 100% on if that occurred.
Okay.
I can tell you either way, you have a dead kid. They used a truck, and they had a dead kid in the back of a truck wrapped in a blanket like one would do garbage. And they picked the kid out of the ground, and they went to look for a quote-unquote better place to bury him. And that's when they chose the location on Filter Lane to bury him. And
Southeast Austin.
Correct.
Okay.
And that was it was in the middle of the night when Michael Turner was brought from San Saba County Jail to that location, and he walked investigators straight to the location. As he described it, what he laid there to place over the gravesite, and he walked them straight to where his body would be found.
He also told investigators, according to court records, that Megan, in order for them to actually see what they were doing, was holding her cell phone up as a light so he can dig that grave.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what he said. And I believe that. I think the light one came in for the first burial, and the second burial, she stayed in the vehicle and she moved the vehicle. And then he actually buried the child himself.
Is it hard for you to say that he's the one with heart?
It is, but I have to look at the totality of the whole event. Again, if he would have just said nothing, if he would have stuck with the silly story that, hey, she told me she gave the kid away, we would have never found Colton. His body would have never been recovered.
Were you there at the scene when his body was found?
I was not. I went to the scene. I saw the burial site. I saw when they had uncovered most of his remains. It was still wrapped in a blanket, but because of the science of it, we weren't going to unwrap him there. We weren't going to do anything to disturb him there. What they did is they took his body and moved him. I think one of the this will never leave me. This will never ever leave me. While Michael pointed out the location to Colton's grave, Detective Tynes, who has to be one of the nicest human beings you'll ever meet, he was very nice to Michael, and he said, "Hey, this is where Colton's buried." Detective Tynes looked down and he said, "Get him out of here." And he was mad. So Detective Tynes stayed there. And he stayed there to be there for that kid. Detective Tynes' flashlight went out. And Detective Tynes stayed there. And one of the things that, like I said, will never leave me is the fact that he sent me a text message. And he said, "My flashlight just went out. Man, it's really dark out here." That poor kid.
He must have been scared.
That was, again, I go back and it's like, man, the stuff you deal with, working this stuff, these cases, it'll never, ever leave you. It'll never leave you. Knowing that kid had nobody, not one human being on his side, and died alone, breaks your heart. And it broke mine. It broke mine. So yeah, that's one of those things that I say. It's like, man, if I never see another dead kid, my life's complete. I'm done. I'm good. Never have to see that again. Because that stuff changes you. It really does.
Is that why you're not in the homicide unit anymore?
That's one of the reasons. One of the biggest reasons. I really, really cared about my cases. I really put a lot of myself in it. There were a lot of people I had as examples in that office. One of the detectives that worked there, he worked there for 20 years. 20 years. His name's Manuel Fuentes. Yeah. Right now he's an investigator for the Travis County DA's office. I remember talking to Manny, and he had told me, like, right when I first got there, he said, man, think about this. You can be good at this job, or you can be great at this job. And the difference is how much you care, how much you put yourself into it. If you want to be great, you got to work. You got to be willing to go that extra mile. If you want to be good, you can just, take the calls and work the case until, there's no more leads here, and you can move on to the next case. But at that point, when talking to Manny, I decided to myself, I'm not going to be good at this. I want to be great at this. And I cannot say that I was great as Manny. I can't say that I was as great as Detective Fugit at doing that job, but I can tell you that every single murder case I worked, I cared about. I really cared. I cared about the family, but mostly I cared about the victim.
I know it because that is how I found you. Yeah. It was because not only is your name all over court documents when it comes to some of the most horrific crimes in Austin and how to solve murders, but you talk about these cases as if they are your own family members. Yeah. As if you knew them, and it's as if you know their family. And I think you have come to know a lot of these family members.
There are a few family members on a few of these cases that I have gotten to know. Mr. and Mrs. Weiser, Dr. Weiser and his wife are some of the sweetest people you'll ever meet in your life. And unfortunately, we were brought together because of this tragic event that occurred to their daughter. But through that, we've gotten to speak to each other and know each other. And my life is just a little bit more rich for getting to have conversation with them. And there are some other victims, their families I've gotten to know. And we will have a conversation here or there, especially the anniversary of the death of their loved one.
What are you doing now at the Austin Police Department?
In December of 2017, I had called it quits with Homicide.
After how many years?
It was almost 8 years. Okay. It was just very short of it, almost a month short of 8 years.
How many homicides do you think you worked on during that time?
Worked on or was assigned straight to me?
There are differences.
There are differences. Yeah. I worked on, if I were to guess, well over 100. Okay. But that were assigned as my cases. I believe, if I remember the count, I think it was around 25 that were assigned to me, and cases that were assigned to my partners, yet I was the person responsible for working the scene, like Detective Tynes was responsible for both of the cases we mentioned, were around 30. Okay. Yeah.
And so you decided, I'm leaving one department, I'm going over to another.
And what I'm doing now is with the Austin Police Department Interdiction Unit. My guys run up and down I-35. They go into the airport. They go into bus stations, and they look for traffickers, whether they be trafficking drugs, the proceeds of those drugs, or they are trafficking illegal copyright infringement.
Sure.
Fake Gucci bags.
Yeah.
But the proceeds of that. That's what we do. And it is so much more carefree. It's silly for me to say it, but it's relaxing. It's so easy as compared to what I was doing in Homicide that I, silly enough, asked for the police department to get me a dog that can detect bulk currency and firearms.
So that is the caller that you hear in the background in this podcast.
That is Yogi. He's a Belgian Malinois, and he is as hyper as a Belgian Malinois will always be.
Well, I know you rushed over here because you were with him not too long ago training. So I appreciate your time, Detective. I know that you have solved a lot of cases, and you have definitely made a difference in many lives in Austin. But before I let you go, do you ever think about Hadika and Colton?
Every day. Every day. Every day. I do that because they were victims. They were in homicide work. Everybody has a word to describe victims. Kids are true victims. They're not out there robbing drug dealers and end up getting killed in the process. They're not out there committing any type of crime. Hadika was walking back to her dorm. She was a true victim. Colton was a true victim. There are many true victims in Austin. And that's not to put down the individual who was murdered in the process of a drug deal.
Sure.
But when you have to handle the case of a missing kid who was dead, and you have to handle the case of a young lady who was beginning her adulthood, and it was taken away. It really touches you. And yeah, every day. Think about them every day. And that'll never go away. Never go away.
Thank you for talking about it.
Absolutely.
In the case of Hadika Weiser, 20-year-old Mikael Kreiner, a foster care runaway, was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison. The university has since made security upgrades on campus to protect students, and shortly after Detective Nelson helped to arrest Kreiner for Hadika's death, University of Texas President Gregory Fenves read this statement from Hadika's family.
Although Haruka loved to perform on stage, she never sought the spotlight in her daily life. Perhaps the last thing she would want is to be the poster child for any cause. And yet, as we struggle to understand why she was killed, if her death can somehow make it safer for a young woman to walk home, it will all prevent another assault or murder. Then at least we could find some meaning behind an otherwise senseless and tragic death.
In the case of 2-year-old Colton Turner, we still don't know how that vibrant little boy died. His small body was too badly decomposed for the medical examiner to make that exact ruling, but we do know whom is going to prison for it. Michael Turner, who is not Colton's biological dad, but was the boyfriend of Colton's mom Megan Work and led Detective Nelson to the body, was sentenced in 2016 to 20 years in prison after he took a plea deal for his role, which included tampering with evidence, after burying Colton. In 2018, 4 years after Colton was found dead, Megan Work pled guilty too. She admitted to not getting Colton medical attention that could have saved his life, but she does not admit to killing him. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Be sure you subscribe to Off Script with Sally Hernandez anywhere you find podcasts.